The heat hit me first when I stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Airfield. Even at 0600, the Afghan sun already promised another scorching day. I'd read about the climate in my briefings, but reading about 110 degrees and actually feeling it press against your uniform are different things entirely. I grabbed my duffel and joined the line of soldiers moving toward the processing tents. After 3 flights and 27 hours of travel, my legs felt like rubber. The smell of diesel fuel and dust filled the air, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the scent of a place that had seen too much conflict for too long. 2 hours later, I found myself standing outside Lieutenant Colonel Lance Foster's office, waiting for my first assignment briefing. The temporary building looked like every other military structure I'd seen. Prefabricated walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional beige that made you forget what color actually looked like. "Hampton, come in." Foster's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades giving orders. I stepped inside and snapped to attention. "Sir?" "At ease, Lieutenant." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Welcome to Afghanistan. I trust your journey wasn't too comfortable." "No, sir, it wasn't." I settled into the metal chair, keeping my posture straight. Foster was exactly what I'd expected from his file. Tall, imposing, with gray hair cut to regulation standards and blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "Good. Comfortable soldiers get careless, and we can't afford careless right now." He opened a folder on his desk. "I've reviewed your psychological operations training, top marks across the board. That's why I'm giving you something that requires a delicate touch." I waited while he pulled out a map marked with red circles and grid coordinates. The terrain looked mountainous, with elevation markers that suggested serious altitude. "There's a village about 60 kilometers northeast of here, tucked into the Hindu Kush. Small place, maybe 300 people. For the past 6 months, they've been increasingly hostile toward NATO forces. Not violent, mind you, but completely uncooperative. No intelligence, no support, nothing." Foster traced a route on the map with his finger. "What makes this interesting is that these same villagers were cooperative as recently as 8 months ago. Something changed, and I need to know what." "Any theories, sir?" "Several. Could be Taliban intimidation. Could be a new local leader with anti-Western sympathies. Could be we accidentally bombed their goat herd." Foster's expression remained neutral, but I caught the hint of frustration in his voice. "That's what you're going to find out." I studied the map, noting the terrain features and the distance from our nearest outpost. The village sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose over 4,000 meters. Getting there would be a challenge, and getting out quickly might be even harder. "What kind of support will I have?" "You'll need a translator, obviously, someone with cultural sensitivity, and given the location, I'd recommend bringing security." Foster closed the folder. "This isn't a combat mission, Hampton. Your job is to talk, listen, and figure out why these people suddenly decided they don't like us anymore." "Understood, sir. When do I leave?" "Tomorrow morning. That gives you today to assemble your team and review what little intelligence we have on the area." Foster stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. "And Hampton? These mountains have a way of complicating simple missions. Stay alert." I spent the next 4 hours in the intelligence section, reading everything available on the village. The files were disappointingly thin. Satellite imagery showed a cluster of mud brick buildings arranged around a central area, with terraced fields climbing the surrounding slopes. Population estimates ranged from 200 to 400 depending on seasonal migration patterns. The village had no official name in our records, just a grid coordinate and a designation: Objective Bravo. The most recent reports came from a medical team that had visited 7 months earlier. They'd described the villagers as friendly but cautious, willing to accept basic medical care but reluctant to discuss local security issues. Nothing in their report suggested the kind of hostility Foster had described. I made notes on the key infrastructure: a small mosque, what appeared to be a school, several wells, and a network of irrigation channels. The access routes were limited: 2 mountain passes that would be treacherous in bad weather and nearly impassable during winter months. By 1400 hours, I'd identified my team members. Drew Wright had caught my attention immediately. 34 years old, fluent in Pashto and Dari, with 3 previous deployments and a reputation for cultural sensitivity. His file mentioned several successful negotiations with village elders, including one situation where he'd helped resolve a water rights dispute that could have escalated into armed conflict. Rose Ramirez was my security choice, 26, with excellent marksmanship scores and experience in mountain warfare. More importantly, her previous commanders consistently noted her ability to maintain composure in unpredictable situations. She'd also worked protective details before, which meant she understood the difference between being ready for trouble and looking for it. I found Drew first in the communications tent, working on radio equipment with the methodical patience of someone who understood that details mattered. He looked up when I approached, his dark eyes taking in my uniform and rank insignia. Sergeant Wright, I'm Lieutenant Hampton. I have a mission that requires your language skills. Sir. He set down his screwdriver and gave me his full attention. What kind of mission? Hearts and minds. There's a village that's gone from cooperative to hostile, and we need to find out why. I handed him the basic briefing sheet. The population speaks Pashto primarily, with some Dari. You familiar with the Hindu Kush region? Drew scanned the paper, his expression growing more serious as he read. I've worked in similar terrain. These mountain communities can be particular about outsiders. What's the current threat assessment? Low for direct violence, high for non-cooperation. We're not expecting a firefight, but we're not ruling it out either. I liked that he'd asked about threats first. It showed tactical awareness. You interested? Yes, sir. When do we leave? Tomorrow at 0700, I'll brief you and the rest of the team tonight. Finding Rose took longer. She was at the firing range, working through what looked like a precision shooting drill. I watched her put 5 rounds through the same hole at 200 meters before interrupting. Sergeant Ramirez? She turned, lowering her rifle and pulling out her ear protection. Sir, I'm Lieutenant Hampton. I need someone for a mission who can handle mountain terrain and keep a low profile while staying ready for trouble. Rose's amber eyes assessed me with the same careful attention she'd been giving her targets. What kind of trouble are we expecting, sir? Probably none, possibly everything. I handed her the same briefing sheet I'd given Drew. It's a 3-person team, 2 days minimum, possibly longer depending on what we find. She read quickly, then looked back at me. Mountain village, hostile population, limited extraction options. She folded the paper. Sounds like fun. Count me in. Good. Team briefing tonight at 2000 hours, conference room 2. The briefing went smoothly. Drew had additional insights about the region's tribal structure, mentioning that villages at that altitude often maintain traditional governance systems that could be sensitive to perceived slights. Rose asked practical questions about extraction procedures and communication protocols. Both seemed competent and professional. We left the next morning in a modified Humvee, taking the mountain road as far as it would go before switching to foot travel. The drive took 3 hours over increasingly rough terrain, with the engine straining against the altitude and the steep grades. The mountains rose around us like ancient monuments, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. The road, really just a dirt track carved into the mountainside, wound through valleys where the air grew thinner with each kilometer. I'd trained at altitude before, but this was different. The Hindu Kush had a presence that made you aware of how small you were. We reached the end of the vehicle-accessible route at around 1100 hours. From there, the path continued on foot, following what Drew identified as an old trading route that had probably been in use for centuries. "How much farther?" Rose asked, shouldering her pack. Drew consulted his GPS and the topographic map. "About 8 kilometers, but it's all uphill from here. We'll gain another 500 meters of elevation." The hike took 4 hours. The path switched back and forth up the mountainside, sometimes disappearing entirely where rock slides had changed the landscape. My legs burned, and I found myself stopping more frequently to catch my breath. Rose and Drew seemed less affected, though I noticed Drew pausing occasionally to let me catch up without making it obvious. We crested the final ridge at 15:30 hours, and the village spread out below us in the valley. From this distance, it looked peaceful. Small buildings arranged around a central area with green fields terraced into the surrounding slopes. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and I could see people moving between the buildings. "There," Drew pointed to a larger structure near the center of the village. "That's probably where we'll find the village leader." We descended the final slope, and I became aware of the silence. No children ran out to greet us. No adults paused in their work to wave or call out. Instead, I felt the weight of watching eyes from every doorway and window. The few villagers we passed on the path looked at us with expressions that ranged from suspicion to outright hostility. A group of men had gathered near the central building by the time we reached it. They stood in a loose semicircle, arms crossed, their body language making it clear we weren't welcome. An older man stepped forward, tall for the region, with graying hair and beard, wearing traditional Afghan clothing with an embroidered vest that suggested some authority. "That's our village leader," Drew said quietly. "I'll handle the introductions." The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Pashto, with Drew translating for Rose and me. The village leader, Bryson Gilbert, according to Drew, spoke with the kind of controlled politeness that barely concealed anger. His responses to Drew's questions were short and formal. "He says we're welcome to rest here for the night, but he wants to know why we've come," Drew translated. I told him we're here to talk about the relationship between his village and the coalition forces. Bryson's next response was longer, and his tone grew sharper. Several of the other men nodded in agreement. "He says they have nothing to discuss with us. They want to be left alone." Drew's expression remained neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He's being very polite about it, but he's essentially telling us to leave. I studied Bryson's face, looking for any hint of what had caused this hostility. His eyes held the kind of deep distrust that comes from personal experience, not just tribal suspicion of outsiders. "Ask him what changed," I said. "Tell him we know they were cooperative before. We want to understand what we did wrong." Drew translated, and Bryson's response came with visible anger. He gestured toward the mountains surrounding us, his voice rising slightly. "He says we destroyed something sacred, something that protected his people." Drew's translation was careful, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "He's talking about the mountain itself, says we damaged something that can't be repaired." I looked around at the peaks surrounding the village, trying to understand what Bryson meant. The mountains looked untouched, ancient and permanent. But then I remembered the mission reports from the past year. Several airstrikes in this region targeting suspected Taliban positions. "Ask him about the airstrikes. Did we hit something specific?" The conversation continued, with Bryson's answers becoming more detailed and emotional. Other villagers had joined the group, including an elderly man who leaned heavily on a walking stick but whose eyes remained sharp and alert. "There was a strike 3 months ago," Drew translated. "They say it damaged part of the sacred mountain. There's some kind of legend about a protective spirit that lives there. The elder wants to explain. The elderly man stepped forward and Bryson moved aside with obvious respect. When the elder spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades being listened to. His explanation was long and detailed, punctuated with gestures toward the mountain peaks. Drew's translation came in pieces as the elder paused between sections. He says there's an ancient spirit called Mardum that has protected this village for hundreds of years. It lives in the sacred mountain and keeps enemies away. Taliban, bandits, foreign armies. But the bombing damaged its home and now the protection is broken. William Peters, that was the elder's name according to Drew, continued speaking, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the air as he described something I couldn't see. He says Mardum has protected them through invasions by the British, the Soviets, even recent Taliban incursions. The spirit turns enemies away, makes them lose their way in the mountains, causes their weapons to fail. Drew's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure how to translate concepts that had no direct equivalent. But when our bombs hit the mountain, they damaged the spirit's dwelling place. Now it's angry and weakened. I glanced at Rose, who was listening intently while keeping her eyes on the crowd of villagers. Her hand rested casually near her sidearm, but her posture remained relaxed and non-threatening. "Ask him where exactly the mountain was damaged," I said. The elder's response came with a gesture toward the eastern peak, the tallest in the immediate area. Even from the village, I could see what looked like fresh scarring on the rock face, lighter-colored stone where something had broken away recently. He says there was a cave system up there, very old, where the spirit dwelt. The bombing caused part of it to collapse. Drew paused as the elder continued. He's saying that without Mardum's protection, the village is vulnerable to its enemies. That's why they can't trust us anymore. We destroyed the thing that kept them safe. Bryson spoke again, his tone becoming more heated. Several other villagers nodded in agreement, and I could see the anger spreading through the group. Bryson says that within weeks of the bombing, Taliban fighters started appearing in the area again. They've been demanding tribute, threatening families. Drew's translation was becoming more urgent. He says for generations his people never had to worry about outside threats because Mardum protected them. Now they're defenseless, and it's our fault. The pieces started coming together. The village's cooperation with NATO forces had probably been based on the belief that they didn't need protection from anyone. They had their ancient guardian. When our airstrike damaged what they considered the spirit's home, we'd essentially destroyed their entire security framework. William Peters stepped closer, his cloudy eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He spoke directly to me, though I couldn't understand a word. "He wants to know if you understand what you've done," Drew translated. He says Mardum was older than memory, older than any human conflict. It didn't choose sides between armies. It just protected the innocent people of this valley. And now, it's gone. I looked up at the scarred mountain peak, trying to process what I'd learned. Whether or not I believed in protective spirits, the villagers clearly did. Our airstrike hadn't just damaged rock and dirt, it had shattered their fundamental sense of security and turned us from potential allies into the people who destroyed their guardian. "Tell them I understand," I said finally. "Tell them we didn't know about the sacred site and we're sorry for the damage." Drew's translation seemed to calm the crowd slightly, but Bryson's response was still cold. He says sorry doesn't bring back the dead or restore what was destroyed. He says as long as Mardum remains wounded, his people will never trust those who wounded it. The sun was starting to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. The temperature was already beginning to drop, and I knew we'd need to find shelter soon. But more importantly, I finally understood what had turned this village from cooperative to hostile. The question now was what, if anything, could be done about it. Cooper knocked on the side of our temporary shelter just after we'd finished our evening rations. The sun had dropped behind the mountain ridge, leaving the village in that purple twilight that made everything look softer than it actually was. "You mentioned earlier about wanting to understand what's happening here," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Would you like to join me for tea? My wife prepared extra." Maxwell looked up from cleaning his rifle. "We need to maintain operational security." "It's just across the square," Cooper said. 10 minutes. I think you'll find the conversation educational." I caught something in his tone that made me pay attention. The way he said educational carried weight, like he was offering more than hospitality. I'd learned to recognize that particular inflection during my previous deployments. It usually meant someone had information they couldn't share in front of a crowd. "I'll go," I said, checking my watch. 2000 hours. "Be back by 21:30. Maxwell nodded once. "Stay alert. Radio check every 30 minutes. Cooper's house sat directly across from the village center, a modest stone structure with a wooden door painted blue. The color had faded and chipped, but someone had maintained it recently. Fresh brush strokes covered the worst damage. His wife greeted us at the door, a small woman with kind eyes who spoke rapid phrases in the local dialect. Cooper translated while she poured tea from a metal pot that had seen decades of use. "She says welcome, and she hopes the tea helps you understand our troubles." The tea was strong and sweet, with cardamom that reminded me of markets I'd visited in Kabul. We sat on cushions around a low wooden table that Cooper had probably built himself. The craftsmanship was solid, but not fancy. "3 children, Cooper said without preamble, setting down his glass. 3 children have disappeared since your bombing last month." I pulled out my notebook, the same one I'd been using to document everything since we arrived. "Tell me about them." The first was Malik, age 7. His mother sent him to collect water from the well at dawn. We found his bucket, but no trace of the boy. Cooper's hands moved while he talked, sketching invisible shapes in the air. The second, Fatima, age 9. She was helping her grandmother with laundry at the river. Her grandmother turned away for perhaps 2 minutes to wring out a blanket. When she looked back, Fatima was gone. I wrote down names, ages, circumstances. Military training had taught me to document everything, even when I wasn't sure it mattered. Especially then. And the third? Cooper's voice dropped lower. Amir, age 11. Last week, he was playing with friends near the edge of the village close to the old shepherd trails. His friends said they heard him call out like he saw something interesting. They ran to look but found only his sandals. Any physical evidence? Tracks, disturbances in the ground? Nothing useful. The terrain there is rocky, hard to leave tracks even if you wanted to. I finished writing and looked up. Cooper was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hopeful exactly, but expectant. "You think these disappearances are connected to what happened to your livestock?" I asked. His eyebrows shot up. "You know about Greg's animals?" "Briefly. I'd like to hear more details." Cooper stood and walked to his window, pushing aside a thin curtain to peer outside. "Greg is a practical man, not given to flights of imagination. He's been farming these hills for 20 years. What did he find? 2 weeks ago, he went to check on his goats in the upper pasture. 23 animals, all dead, but not killed by wolves or wild dogs." Cooper turned back toward me. "Arranged." "Arranged how?" "In a circle. Perfect circle, with their heads pointing toward the center. No blood on the ground, though their throats had been cut. No scavenger marks, no signs of struggle." Cooper sat back down, his voice picking up speed. And in the center of the circle, something had been carved into the earth. Symbols none of us recognized. I wrote faster. Did anyone photograph these symbols? Greg tried to show them to our village council, but when we returned the next morning, rain had washed away the markings. Only the dead animals remained. The story had details that made it harder to dismiss. Rain washing away evidence was exactly the kind of thing that happened in real investigations. Too convenient to ignore, too mundane to be invented. I'd like to speak with Greg directly. Tomorrow. He doesn't like to talk about it after dark. Cooper refilled our tea glasses, the metal pot making soft clinking sounds against the rim. Outside, I could hear the village settling into evening routines. Doors closing, voices calling children inside, the distant bleating of goats being secured for the night. "There's more you should see," Cooper said. "Storm has been documenting the human casualties. She's our doctor, trained in the city before she returned here to help her family." Casualties from what? The adults who've tried to investigate, who've gone looking for the children or tried to track whatever's taking them. Cooper set down the teapot with more force than necessary. 4 men in the past 3 weeks. Experienced hunters, men who know these mountains better than anyone. What happened to them? Come. Storm lives next door. She can show you better than I can explain. We left Cooper's house and walked 20 steps to another stone building, this one with a wooden sign in both local script and English. Medical clinic. Cooper knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. Some kind of recognition signal. Storm opened the door immediately, like she'd been waiting. She was smaller than I'd expected from Cooper's description, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with intelligent dark eyes and black hair covered by a traditional headscarf. She wore practical clothes and had a stethoscope around her neck even at this hour. "You're the American soldier Cooper mentioned," she said in accented but clear English. "Come inside, quickly." Her clinic was clean and well organized with medical supplies I recognized from Army field hospitals. Basic but professional. She led us to a desk in the back room where she kept her files. "I've been documenting everything since the incidents began," she said, opening a folder. "Someone needs to maintain records." She pulled out 4 photographs and arranged them on the desk. Black and white, clearly taken with a decent camera under good lighting conditions. Professional quality, not snapshots. These are the men who went missing while searching for the children. I looked at the first photograph and felt my stomach tighten. The body was intact except for the head, which was missing entirely. Clean separation at the neck, like surgical amputation. "No head recovered?" I asked. "None of them. Look at the second." The second photograph showed a different body, same condition. Missing head, but also empty eye sockets where the eyes should have been. The third. This one was missing the head and had the tongue removed. The mouth hung open, showing the absence clearly. And the fourth. Head gone, eyes gone, tongue gone. All the same clean, precise removals. I studied each photograph carefully, making notes about what I observed. The wounds were too clean for animal attacks, too precise for amateur butchery. These looked almost medical in their execution. "Have you shared these with any outside authorities?" I asked. Storm shook her head. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what could they do? Send investigators who would just become more victims? "What's your medical opinion about these injuries?" "Surgical tools, someone with anatomical knowledge, but the precision." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've seen battlefield trauma, accident victims, even deliberate violence. This is different, too perfect. Like the person doing this has done it many times before." I finished writing and closed my notebook. "Thank you for showing me these. I know this can't be easy. It's necessary, Storm said simply. Someone needs to witness what's happening here. Cooper and I walked back across the square toward our shelter. The village was completely quiet now, no lights showing in any windows. Even the animals had stopped making noise. Your team leader, Cooper said as we approached our temporary camp. Will he believe what you've seen? I don't know. Maxwell tends to stick to what he can verify through official channels. And you? I thought about the photographs, the precise nature of the wounds, the organized arrangement of dead livestock. I believe something's happening here that doesn't fit normal patterns. Whether it's what you think it is, that's harder to say. Maxwell was still awake when I returned, reviewing maps by flashlight. Rose and Drew were already in their sleeping bags. Productive conversation? Maxwell asked without looking up. Informative. The villagers have experienced a series of disappearances and deaths since the bombing. Children and adults both. Local crime happens everywhere there's instability. Maybe, but the pattern's unusual. Very specific methodology to the killings. Maxwell finally looked up. Methodology? I described what Storm had shown me, keeping my language clinical and factual. Maxwell listened without interrupting, but I could see skepticism building in his expression. Photographs can be staged, he said when I finished. Local politics get complicated. Sometimes communities create external threats to unify against instead of dealing with internal problems. You think they're making this up? I think grieving people sometimes see patterns that aren't there. Our job is to maintain security and gather intelligence about actual threats, not chase local folklore. I wanted to argue, but Maxwell's tone indicated the conversation was over. He was team leader, and he'd made his assessment. My job was to follow orders and document what I observed. Understood. I'll continue gathering information for the report. Good, but don't get pulled into their local dramas. We have real work to do here. I settled into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. The photographs kept cycling through my mind, along with Cooper's description of the arranged livestock. Too many specific details for simple invention, but too strange for normal crime. The next morning, I walked through the village during my assigned patrol, paying attention to details I'd missed before. Every doorway had symbols carved into the wood or stone. Not decorative patterns, these looked protective, like wards or barriers. Fresh carvings, too. Recently maintained, children wore small cloth pouches around their necks, and I caught glimpses of metal objects inside when the fabric shifted. Amulets or talismans of some kind. Every single child had them. Adults moved in groups, never alone. Even quick trips to collect water or tend animals involved at least 2 people. The kind of behavior you see in communities under active threat. I noticed Ellen Gilbert especially, the 8-year-old daughter of the village leader. She stayed within 10 feet of her father at all times, and when he had to speak with other adults, she positioned herself behind him with her back to a wall. Constant vigilance, like she expected something to grab her from any direction. Bryson kept one hand on her shoulder whenever they moved through the village. Not casual parental affection, protective positioning. The kind of grip that said he was ready to physically hold on to her if something tried to take her away. She's all I have left, he told me when he noticed my attention. My son Landon was taken 2 months ago, 12 years old, smart boy, always asking questions about everything. I'm sorry for your loss. He wanted to explore the old caves in the upper ridges. I told him no, too dangerous, but boys that age. Bryson's grip tightened on Ellen's shoulder. We found his clothes near the cave entrance. Nothing else. Ellen looked up at me with large brown eyes that held too much understanding for someone her age. She didn't speak, just watched and listened like she was cataloging everything around her for potential threats. She hasn't spoken since we lost Landon, Bryson said quietly. Dr. Storm says it's trauma, but I think she's just being careful. Sound travels in these mountains. Better to stay quiet. I crouched down to Ellen's eye level, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening. I'm Frank. I'm here to help keep everyone safe. She nodded once but didn't smile or respond verbally. Her hand moved to the cloth pouch around her neck, fingers checking that it was still there. Standing back up, I could see the exhaustion in Bryson's face. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from months of constant vigilance. He was protecting his daughter every minute of every day, and it was wearing him down. But given what had happened to his son and the other children who disappeared, his protective behavior made complete sense. Whether the threat was supernatural or simply human, something was definitely hunting the children of this village. And Ellen Gilbert, quiet and watchful behind her father's protective presence, seemed to understand that better than anyone. Albert disappeared on a Tuesday night. I'd been reviewing my notes when I heard Rose calling from the perimeter. Her voice carried that particular edge she got when something wasn't right. Sharp, controlled, but with an undercurrent that made you drop whatever you were doing and listen. Albert missed his check-in. Maxwell emerged from the command tent, already reaching for his radio. Albert Jones ran security like clockwork. 20-minute intervals, every patrol, no exceptions. The man treated timekeeping like a religious practice. When was his last report? 23:42. Should have called in at 00:02. I checked my watch, 00:26. Albert was never late, not by minutes, not by seconds. Maxwell keyed his radio. Jones, report your position. Static. Jones, respond. Nothing. Rose was already checking her gear. Last position was grid 77 Alpha, heading northeast along the ridge line. Standard patrol route? Yeah, but he mentioned wanting to check the cave system up there. Said he'd seen movement during the day shift. My stomach dropped. The caves, where we'd found the remains of the other children. Maxwell organized the search with military efficiency. But I could see the tension in how he held his shoulders, the way he double-checked his ammunition. 3 teams, overlapping search patterns, maintain radio contact every 10 minutes. I partnered with Rose, taking the eastern approach toward the ridge. The night vision turned everything into green-tinted shadows, but it couldn't penetrate the psychological weight that seemed to press down from the mountains. Rose moved like she was expecting contact, rifle ready, head constantly turning to scan our surroundings. You think he went into those caves? Albert's not stupid, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He knows the protocols. We searched until dawn painted the peaks orange and gold. Maxwell called us back just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, his voice flat over the radio. All teams returned to base. We found him. The body lay in a clearing about 200 meters from the cave entrance. Albert's equipment was scattered in a rough circle around him. Radio here, rifle there, ammunition scattered like someone had emptied his pouches and flung everything aside. His uniform was shredded, but not by any weapon I recognized. Maxwell crouched next to the body, his face pale in the morning light. Same pattern as the village victims. He was right. The wounds were identical, precise, deep cuts that seemed almost surgical in their placement. But what bothered me more was Albert's expression. His eyes were wide open, mouth slightly parted, like he'd been trying to say something when he died. Rose stood at the perimeter, scanning the tree line. No tracks leading away from the scene. What about approaching? Just Albert's boots, nothing else. I walked the entire clearing, looking for any sign of what had killed him. Broken branches, disturbed soil, blood trail. Anything that might indicate how this had happened. But the evidence told an impossible story. Albert had walked into this clearing alone and died there, torn apart by something that left no trace of its presence. "We need to get him back to base," Maxwell said. His voice carried a new quality I hadn't heard before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Uncertainty. The next few days changed the whole dynamic of our unit. Maxwell stopped scheduling night patrols. When questioned by higher command, he cited insufficient intelligence on enemy movement patterns and need for enhanced security protocols. Military speak for something's out there and I don't know what it is. Rose started checking her gear obsessively, cleaning her rifle twice a day and carrying extra ammunition. She'd always been cautious, but now she moved like someone expecting an ambush around every corner. Even our interactions with the village became more strained. Where before we'd maintained professional but cordial relationships with the locals, now every conversation felt charged with unspoken tension. The villagers watched us with expressions I couldn't quite read. Sympathy maybe, or recognition of something we were only beginning to understand. I threw myself into my investigation, documenting everything with renewed intensity. Albert's death had provided more data points, but they only deepened the mystery. The pattern of wounds, the lack of conventional forensic evidence, the way his equipment had been scattered, it all reinforced the impossible nature of what we were dealing with. Bryson Gilbert's behavior became increasingly erratic. I'd see him following Ellen everywhere, never letting her out of his sight. When she played with the other children, he'd position himself where he could watch the entire area. At night, he'd patrol around his house, sometimes until dawn. During one of our daily briefings, I mentioned Bryson's protective behavior to Maxwell. "Can you blame him?" Maxwell said. "We lost one of our own. These people have been living with this for months. But his level of vigilance suggests he knows something specific, something about timing or methodology." Maxwell just looked at me with that expression he got when he thought I was overthinking things. But I wasn't overthinking. I was finally starting to see the pattern. The attacks happened in cycles. Every few weeks, another child would disappear. Always at night, always alone, always found days later in the same condition. But now I realized there was something else. A progression. The victims were getting older. First it had been the youngest children, 5 and 6 years old. Then 7 and 8. Ellen Gilbert was 9. Thursday evening I was updating my notes when I heard shouting from outside my quarters. Not the controlled military communication we were used to, but raw panic. Someone calling out in desperate, broken English mixed with local dialect. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside. Bryson was running through the village center calling Ellen's name. His voice cracked with each repetition, getting higher and more frantic. "Ellen! Ellen, where are you?" Rose appeared next to me, already in full gear. "What's happening?" "Ellen's missing." Bryson spotted us and ran over, switching to English when he saw our uniforms. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes wide with terror. "She was in the house. I went to check the perimeter, 5 minutes, maybe 10. When I came back, she was gone." "When did the sun set?" Rose asked. I checked my watch. "About 40 minutes ago." Rose's expression tightened. "We need to organize a search now." "No," Bryson said, grabbing my arm. "No search. I know where she went. I know where it took her." "Where?" "The caves. Always the caves." Rose stepped closer, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she used in tactical situations. "Frank, this is exactly what happened to Albert. You follow that man into those mountains at night, you're going to end up the same way." She was right, and I knew it. Every rational part of my military training told me to wait for daylight, organize proper support, approach this systematically. But looking at Bryson's face, the raw terror of a father who'd already lost everything else, rationality felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I understand the risks. Do you? Because Albert understood them too, and he's dead. I checked my rifle, verified my night vision equipment, made sure my radio was functioning. Ellen's been missing for almost an hour. In another hour, it'll be 2. By dawn, I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. We'd all seen what dawn revealed. Rose grabbed my shoulder. Frank, listen to me. Whatever killed Albert, whatever's been taking these children, it's not human. Normal tactics don't apply here. Then what do you suggest? Wait for backup. Wait for daylight. Wait for some kind of plan that doesn't involve walking into those mountains blind. Bryson was already moving toward the village edge, heading for the mountain trail. With or without us, he was going after his daughter. I shouldered my rifle and checked my gear one final time. Rose, if I don't report in by dawn, tell Maxwell what happened. Document everything. Frank. But I was already following Bryson into the darkness, leaving the safety of our perimeter behind. The mountains waited ahead of us, silent and patient, holding whatever had taken Ellen Gilbert in their shadowed depths. My legs burned within the first 10 minutes of following Bryson up the mountain path. The guy moved like he'd been born on these slopes, sure-footed even in the dark, never hesitating at loose rocks or steep drops that had me second-guessing every step. My night vision gear helped, but only to a point. The green-tinted world it showed me was flat, depthless. Every shadow could hide a drop-off. Every rock could roll out from under my boots. I kept losing sight of Bryson's silhouette ahead of me, then catching glimpses of his jacket when he paused to navigate around a boulder or step over a gap I couldn't see until I was right on top of it. The path, if you could call it that, wound between massive stone formations that jutted up from the mountainside like broken teeth. Wind whistled through the gaps, carrying sounds I couldn't identify. Maybe just air moving over rock. Maybe something else. Bryson didn't slow down, didn't look back to check if I was keeping up. His focus was total, almost frantic. The way he moved reminded me of search and rescue operations I'd observed during training. That combination of urgency and precision you get when someone's life depends on covering ground fast without breaking your neck doing it. My gear weighed on me more than usual. The night vision mount pressed against my forehead, and my rifle kept catching on rocky outcrops. I'd trained for mountain operations, but this wasn't training. This was chasing a local villager up a goat trail in hostile territory, following a lead that made no tactical sense. The terrain started opening up as we climbed higher. Fewer tight passages, more open slopes covered in loose shale that shifted under our feet. Bryson picked up the pace, and I had to focus entirely on not losing my footing. One wrong step and I'd slide 20 feet down into rocks that would crack ribs without much effort. We'd been climbing for maybe 20 minutes when Bryson suddenly stopped ahead of me. I almost ran into him before I realized he'd frozen completely, his whole body tense. He was staring down into what looked like a narrow ravine cutting across our path. I moved up beside him, trying to see what had caught his attention. The ravine wasn't deep, maybe 15 feet across, but it was dark even with the night vision. Just a black slash in the mountainside that seemed to swallow light. Then I saw movement down there. My blood went cold. Something was dragging across the rocky bottom of the ravine, something small, Ellen's size. I dropped to one knee, adjusting my night vision, trying to get a clearer picture. The movement was erratic, like someone being pulled against their will. I could make out pale fabric, the same light-colored dress Ellen had been wearing when I'd seen her in the village. But what was pulling her made my stomach drop. The shape was massive, easily twice the size of any human, but it moved wrong, too fluid, too quick for something that big. In the green wash of my night vision, it looked like a dark stain against the rocks, constantly shifting, hard to focus on. I grabbed Bryson's arm, pointed down into the ravine. "There," I whispered. He saw it immediately. His whole body went rigid and I heard him suck in a sharp breath. Then he was moving, scrambling down the rocky slope toward the ravine floor. "Wait," I called after him, but he wasn't listening. I followed, half sliding down the loose rocks, trying to keep my rifle from banging against the stones. The terrain was even more treacherous than it looked. Every step sent small avalanches of pebbles clattering ahead of us. When I reached the bottom, I nearly stepped on it. A handprint, pressed deep into the dirt beside a flat boulder. But not any handprint I'd ever seen. The thing was enormous, easily 18 inches from palm to fingertip. The fingers were too long, too thin. And there were marks in the soil around it where whatever had made it had braced itself, like it had been lifting something heavy. Something Ellen's weight. Bryson saw it too. He stopped dead, looking down at the impression in the dirt. Then he started speaking. Not to me, but to something else. Words in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Prayer. Urgent, desperate prayer. The words echoed off the ravine walls, bouncing back distorted. And as they did, I realized the dragging sounds had stopped. Everything had gone completely silent. Bryson kept moving forward, still praying, his voice getting louder. The words seemed to roll through the darkness ahead of us, and I had the strangest feeling they were being heard. Not by me, but by whatever had left that handprint. That's when I saw it rise. A shadow detached itself from the rocks about 30 yards ahead. But calling it a shadow didn't do it justice. This was darkness that had weight, substance. It rose up and up, easily 12 feet tall, maybe more. And as it moved, the darkness around it seemed to deepen, like it was pulling light into itself. Ellen was there at the base of it. She scrambled away on her hands and knees, moving toward us across the rocky ground. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt, but she was moving under her own power. But Bryson didn't stop. He kept walking toward the thing, his prayers getting louder, more insistent. The ancient words bounced off the canyon walls like gunshots. I wanted to grab him, pull him back. This was insane. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something you walked up to and had a conversation with. But I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off the shapeless mass of darkness that seemed to be considering Bryson's approach. Ellen reached me, grabbing at my pants leg. I pulled her behind me, keeping my rifle trained on the entity ahead, though I had no idea what good bullets would do against something that looked like animated shadow. Bryson was within 10 feet of it now. The darkness seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. And then it moved. The entity flowed forward, not walking but gliding over the ground. It wrapped around Bryson like fog, and his prayers cut off mid-word. Just stopped, as if someone had hit a switch. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no shifting rocks, nothing. When the darkness pulled back, Bryson was gone. Dawn came too soon. I'd barely managed 3 hours of sleep when Melvin Jacobs shook my shoulder, his weathered face grim in the gray morning light. The search party had assembled while I'd been unconscious. 6 men from the village, all carrying the kind of equipment you didn't want to think too hard about. "We found tracks," Melvin said simply, "leading up the north face." I grabbed my gear and followed him out of the village. The morning air carried that thin, cold bite you only get at altitude, and my breath came out in small puffs as we climbed. Melvin moved with the same sure-footed confidence as Bryson had, but there was something different in his posture now. Tension. The kind that came from expecting to find something you didn't want to see. The tracks led up a narrow game trail, barely wide enough for single file. Scuff marks in the dirt, a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush, drops of something dark staining the rocks. I didn't need Melvin to tell me it was blood. We found Bryson about 200 meters up the trail in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. Or what was left of him. I'd seen combat casualties before. IED explosions, sniper wounds, the kind of damage that high-velocity rounds could do to human tissue. But this was different, clinical, precise in a way that made my stomach clench. No head, no eyes, no tongue. Just like Ellen had described, just like the other children who'd gone missing. Melvin knelt beside the body, his calloused hands moving in what looked like a prayer. The other men hung back, unwilling to get closer, their faces pale despite the morning sun. "Same as the others," Melvin said quietly. "Exact same." I forced myself to examine the scene properly. The cuts were clean, surgical almost. No tearing or ragged edges that would suggest an animal attack. No defensive wounds on Bryson's hands. His rifle lay beside him, unfired, safety still engaged. "He didn't fight back," I said. Melvin nodded grimly. "Couldn't. Whatever did this, he never saw it coming." The clearing was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, even the wind seemed to have died. Just the sound of our breathing and the distant murmur of the other men's prayers. We wrapped Bryson's body in a tarp and carried him back down the mountain. The descent took longer than the climb, partly because of the weight, mostly because none of us wanted to move too fast, like we were afraid that whatever had taken him might still be watching. Ellen was waiting when we returned to the village, her dark eyes fixed on the tarp-wrapped bundle we carried. She didn't ask any questions, didn't need to. The expression on her face told me she already knew what we'd found. I made sure she stayed with her aunt while I radioed back to base. The conversation with Commander Edna Dean was brief and to the point. I gave her the facts. 1 Afghan civilian dead, same pattern as the previous victims, search party returning with body for proper burial. "Recommendation?" Dean asked. "Immediate evacuation, ma'am. Full withdrawal from the region." A pause. Static crackled over the radio. "Confirmed. Pack up and move out. I want you back here by 1800 hours. No argument. No questions about cost or mission objectives. Just a clean, decisive order from a commander who understood when the tactical situation had gone beyond acceptable risk." We were off that mountain by noon. The debrief took place 2 days later in a sterile conference room at Bagram. Fluorescent lights, gray walls, the kind of institutional setting that made everything feel distant and manageable. Noah Sutton sat across from me with a digital recorder and a thick file folder, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the overhead lights. "Walk me through the events again," he said in that measured academic tone of his. I'd already filed my written report, but military procedure demanded verbal confirmation. I laid out the timeline, the missing children, Bryson's investigation, his disappearance during our night patrol, the discovery of his body the following morning. "And the condition of the remains?" Sutton asked. "Decapitated, eyes and tongue removed, same as the other victims." Sutton made a note in his file. "Your assessment of the perpetrator?" This was the moment I'd been dreading, the part where I had to put into official language what I'd witnessed on that mountain, the part where I sounded like someone who'd cracked under pressure. "Unknown hostile with advanced tactical capabilities," I said carefully. "Able to operate undetected in mountainous terrain, skilled in silent takedown techniques." "Human?" The question hung in the air between us. I thought about Bryson vanishing mid-prayer, about the unnatural silence that had followed, about Ellen's description of something that moved like shadow. "Unclear," I said finally. Sutton's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me over his glasses, the kind of look that said he was measuring my words against my psychological profile. "Elaborate." The tactical pattern suggests training beyond what we'd expect from local insurgent groups. The precision of the mutilations, the ability to neutralize targets without triggering defensive responses, the complete absence of conventional forensic evidence. I was dancing around it, using military terminology to describe something that didn't fit any conventional threat assessment. Sutton nodded slowly, like he was following my logic. Recommendation: permanent classification of the region as hostile territory. No further civilian or military operations without significant force protection assets. Sutton closed the file and turned off the recorder. Your report will be forwarded to operational planning. The supernatural elements will be noted as unconfirmed local beliefs, not actionable intelligence. I started to object, but he held up a hand. However, he continued, the security threat is real and documented. No additional personnel will be deployed to that sector without proper force structure. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was something. I left the conference room thinking that maybe, just maybe, my warnings had been heard. 3 weeks later, Sutton called me back to his office. Remember that region you reported on? He said without preamble. Command decided to send another SWIOP team to follow up on your intelligence. My blood went cold. Sir? Team leader Thelma Gibson, 5 specialists. They deployed 2 weeks ago to establish contact with village leadership and assess the ongoing security situation. The words came out before I could stop them. Sir, I specifically recommended against any further operations in that area. Your recommendations were noted, however, higher command felt that a properly equipped team could handle the situation. I knew Thelma Gibson by reputation. Competent, thorough, the kind of officer who believed that superior training and equipment could overcome any tactical challenge. The kind who would dismiss local superstitions as psychological warfare. Have they reported in? I asked. Sutton's expression answered before his words did. Last communication was 5 days ago. Search and rescue found them yesterday morning. The details came out in clipped professional language. All 6 team members deceased. Found in their base camp, no signs of struggle or defensive action. Same pattern of mutilation as the previous victims. Decapitated, eyes removed, tongues cut out. I sat in that sterile conference room listening to Sutton's clinical recitation and felt something cold settle in my chest. 6 more people dead because someone in command thought they could solve with firepower what I'd barely escaped with my life. The area has been redesignated as permanently hostile, Sutton said. No further operations authorized. Too little, too late. But at least no one else would die because they thought they could handle whatever was hunting in those mountains. I walked out of that briefing knowing I'd carry those 6 names with me for the rest of my life. Thelma Gibson and 5 specialists whose confidence had gotten them killed, just like I'd warned it would. The mountains had claimed their final victims from our unit, but somehow I didn't think they were finished feeding. I submitted my resignation papers 3 weeks after Noah Sutton told me about Gibson's team. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus during drills, couldn't pretend that sending more soldiers into those mountains made any kind of tactical sense. Every time I saw a new deployment roster or heard officers discussing mission parameters, I thought about Thelma Gibson's confident voice on that radio transmission. How certain she'd sounded about handling whatever had taken my unit. The Army didn't make it easy. Captain Morse called me into his office twice, asking if I wanted to reconsider. Good soldiers were hard to find, he said. My record was clean, my evaluation solid. Why throw away a promising career over one difficult deployment? Personal reasons, sir. Hampton, you've been in country for 8 months. You've seen action before. What makes this different? I sat in that metal chair looking at the motivational posters on his wall and tried to figure out how to explain that I'd watched something impossible tear through my team. That I'd heard Bryson Gilbert pray in a language I'd never encountered before. Something pulled him into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. That every official report I'd filed had been sanitized, edited, or buried entirely. Just ready to move on, sir. Morse signed the papers eventually. Took another month for the discharge to process, and during that time I found myself assigned to administrative duties. Filing reports, updating databases, organizing records. Busy work to keep me occupied while they figured out what to do with a soldier who wanted out. That's when I discovered what they'd done to my Afghanistan reports. I was transferring files from one database to another when I came across the official incident summary for our mountain operation. Expected to see my detailed accounts of the missing villagers, the strange behavior we'd observed, the unexplained disappearances of my team members. Instead, I found a 3-paragraph summary describing a Taliban ambush that had resulted in multiple casualties during a routine patrol. According to the official record, enemy combatants had used superior knowledge of local terrain to stage a coordinated attack on our unit. Bell, Foster, Wright, and Ramirez had been killed by small arms fire and improvised explosive devices. I'd been the sole survivor, rescued by helicopter after calling for emergency extraction. The village had been abandoned due to ongoing insurgent activity in the region. No mention of Bryson Gilbert. No reference to the missing children. Nothing about the entity that had taken my teammates one by one in complete silence. The mountains themselves had been reduced to generic, difficult terrain that had aided enemy forces. I printed a copy of that report and read it 4 times, trying to find any trace of what had actually happened. The dates were correct. The location matched. My name appeared as the surviving witness, but everything else, every detail that mattered, every piece of evidence that might have warned future units about what waited in those peaks, had been scrubbed clean. Someone had decided that a Taliban ambush made more sense than the truth. Easier to explain to families, simpler to include in casualty statistics, less likely to raise uncomfortable questions about phenomena that didn't fit into standard military doctrine. I burned that report the same night I received my discharge papers. The transition to civilian life should have been straightforward. I'd saved most of my deployment pay, had enough to cover rent and expenses while I figured out my next move. Applied for jobs in security, law enforcement, anything that might use my military training. Avoided anything that required extensive background interviews. Didn't trust myself to keep the official story straight when asked about my service record. But the real challenge wasn't finding work or adjusting to civilian schedules. The real problem was the mountains. I'd grown up in Colorado, spent summers hiking and camping in the Rockies. Always enjoyed the solitude, the physical challenge of steep trails, the way dawn looked from a high ridge. After Afghanistan, I couldn't handle elevation changes above a few hundred feet. Didn't matter if it was broad daylight or if I was surrounded by other hikers. Something about the way peaks cut into the sky, the way shadows fell across steep slopes made my chest tighten and my hands shake. Moved to Kansas instead. Flat horizon in every direction, no unexpected ridges or hidden valleys, no places where something large and patient might wait in the darkness. Even there I had rules. Home before sunset every night. Double-checked door locks. Kept lights on in at least 2 rooms until I went to bed. Avoided camping, hiking, any activity that put me outdoors after dark. Friends from work invited me to weekend trips, fishing expeditions, overnight camping in state parks. I made excuses, claimed I preferred city life now. Suggested day trips instead. They probably thought military service had made me paranoid about security. Let them think that. Better than trying to explain that I'd learned there were things in the world that didn't care about human weapons or tactics or superior training. The nightmares started about 6 months after my discharge. Always the same sequence of images. That massive shape rising from the darkness, blotting out stars as it moved. Bryson's voice cutting off mid-prayer. The complete silence that followed, heavy and expectant, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced I could still hear that final word Bryson had spoken before disappearing. Some phrase in his native language that had sounded like a plea or a warning. I'd tried looking it up online, searching for translation sites that might help me understand what he'd been trying to say. Never found anything that matched the sounds I remembered. Started seeing a therapist after the third week of interrupted sleep. Dr. Patricia Williams, recommended by the VA, professional patient experienced with combat veterans who struggled with readjustment issues. I told her about difficulty sleeping, recurring dreams about my deployment, problems with certain environments that triggered anxiety responses. It sounds like you experienced some significant trauma during your service. Standard deployment challenges. Hey Frank, many soldiers find it helpful to discuss specific incidents that continue to affect them. Sometimes giving voice to these experiences can reduce their power over your daily life. I sat in her office looking at her diplomas on the wall, her bookshelf full of psychological texts, the box of tissues positioned carefully within reach. Thought about explaining that I'd watched my teammates disappear one by one into something that couldn't be killed, reasoned with, or understood. That official military records had classified their deaths as enemy action because the truth was too inconvenient to acknowledge. I'd rather focus on managing the symptoms. She prescribed medication for anxiety and sleep disturbances. Recommended relaxation techniques, regular exercise, maintaining social connections. Standard treatment protocols for post-traumatic stress. Helpful advice for soldiers who'd lost friends to roadside bombs or sniper attacks or any of the conventional horrors of modern warfare. But my friends hadn't died in combat. They'd been taken by something that existed outside normal categories of threat assessment. Something that had been hunting in those mountains long before American forces arrived in Afghanistan and would continue hunting long after we left. The medication helped with sleep, at least initially. Fewer nightmares, longer periods of unconsciousness. But even medicated sleep brought dreams of shadows and stone of Bryson's terrified face in those final seconds before the darkness claimed him. I'd wake up knowing I'd been somewhere else. Somewhere high and cold where something patient and hungry waited for the next group of soldiers who thought their training made them invincible. Years passed. I found steady work as a security supervisor for a logistics company, managing warehouse operations and coordinating shipping schedules. Safe, predictable, entirely ground-level employment. My colleagues knew I was former military but didn't push for details about my service. Most veterans preferred not to discuss their deployments anyway. Built a routine that kept me functional. Work, gym, home. Avoided movies about military operations, news reports from Afghanistan, anything that might trigger unwanted memories. Dated occasionally, but never seriously enough to explain why I refused overnight trips or camping expeditions. Easier to keep relationships casual than to justify the specific limitations that governed my daily life. But the truth had weight, carrying knowledge that contradicted every official record, every casualty report, every briefing that future units would receive about mountain operations. That burden never got lighter. Sometimes I'd see news reports about missing hikers or unexplained disappearances in remote areas and wonder if other people had encountered similar entities. If there were more places where something ancient and territorial still claimed its own. I'd think about Gibson's team, about how confident she'd sounded on that radio transmission, how certain she'd been that superior equipment and training would succeed where we'd failed. Wonder if she'd had time to understand what was happening before it took her, or if she'd died still believing she was facing conventional enemy forces. The official records would list them as combat casualties just like my teammates. Families would receive flag-draped coffins and military honors. Officers would study tactical reports and adjust future mission parameters to account for improved enemy capabilities in mountainous terrain. Nobody would learn anything useful about the actual threat because acknowledging the truth would require admitting that some dangers couldn't be countered with better equipment or revised tactics. I'd tried warning them, filed detailed reports, requested additional reconnaissance, recommended avoiding that entire region until we better understood what had happened to the missing villagers. Every suggestion had been dismissed, every warning ignored, every piece of evidence sanitized into something that fit existing threat models. The system had chosen to sacrifice Gibson's team rather than acknowledge phenomena that challenged standard operational assumptions. Chosen to maintain comfortable illusions rather than confront uncomfortable realities. And now their families would receive the same sanitized explanations, the same carefully edited version of events that protected institutional credibility while burying the truth about what actually killed their loved ones. I lived with that knowledge every day. Every morning when I woke up safe in my ground floor apartment, every evening when I checked the locks and turned on the lights, every time I chose a restaurant or job or vacation destination based on elevation and proximity to mountain ranges. The entity in those Afghan peaks had taken my teammates, but it had left me with something arguably worse, the burden of being the only person who knew what had really happened, and the only person who understood that it was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next group of soldiers who thought their training made them immune to ancient hungers. The mountains had taught me that some truths were too dangerous for official acknowledgement, that survival sometimes meant accepting explanations that made no tactical sense but preserved institutional stability, that the real enemy wasn't always the one you could see or understand or fight with conventional weapons. And in the years since my discharge, as I'd built this careful, constrained life far from any terrain that might hide something patient and territorial, I'd learned that the hardest part wasn't surviving the encounter itself. The hardest part was living afterward with knowledge that nobody wanted to hear, carrying truth that contradicted every official narrative, knowing that somewhere in those distant mountains, something was still feeding.